First of all, welcome everyone. My name's Wes Williams. I'm a professor of French literature. I'm also the director of Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, which holds, curates, cares very much for the Humanities Cultural Programme, which our ambition and our hope through the Humanities Cultural Programme is to forge inclusive, cross-disciplinary and exciting conversations and performances which extend our imagination of what's possible, both in Oxford but also more broadly, at the intersection of research and performance. In other words, we're trying to reimagine collaborative, creative practice and to engage new audiences in the cultural adventure of events and activity that take place across Oxford City and indeed beyond. All of this in the lead up to the opening of the Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities, currently set for completion in about 3 years' time. To Jenny Wong. Jenny's visiting fellowship started with us in the HCP, the Humanities Culture Programme, back in January. And along with her Oxford University host, Professor Jennifer Altahanger, Jenny has been working on her project, A Personal History of Home, about which you'll find more in your programme and also hopefully in the collection of poems which you may have picked up. Jenny's fellowship in some sense culminates with the two activities here today, this evening. The first event is a roundtable discussion, Home Away from Home, chaired by Oxford colleagues and Professor Margaret Hillenbrand along with Professor Jennifer Altahanger, with panelists Dr. Denise Kwan and Nina Mingya Powles, and of course Jenny herself. Following this conversation and after a short break, Jenny will then be joined by a selection of workshop participants, writers and artists, for a collective reading. And I say workshop participants because one of the strengths of Jenny's fellowship over the last nearly year has been a whole series of workshops across town in a range of different places, thinking away at the question of home. And you'll understand why I put it that way when you hear the poems. The collective reading then will be A Tapestry of Homes. Jenny will also be sharing her own work written as part of this visiting fellowship. That's it from me. I'll hand over without any delay to our hosts for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wes. So welcome everyone. It is wonderful to see you this evening. Thank you for joining us for what I'm sure will be a fascinating conversation about the work of three wonderful artists and writers whom we have with us this evening. Now, Margaret and I have prepared a couple of questions which we will ask in the course of the next circa 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A, in which, as Wes said, you will get an opportunity to ask questions as well, picking up maybe on some of the themes we hope will be of interest to you, but also adding hopefully other things that you think we should chat and talk further about. Now, in lieu of an introduction to our three speakers, which you have in the handout on your seat, we thought we'd ask our three presenters to say or read a little bit from their own work, after which Margaret will pick up with the first question and get our conversation started. So maybe I could ask Nina, would you like to start us off with your reading?
I would love to. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for that intro. I'm just going to read one poem from my book, which came out in 2020, which was published by Nine Arches Press in the UK, and it's out in New Zealand and in the US as well. The book's called Magnolia Mulan, and this poem is called Sonnet with Particles of Gold. Today, scientists discovered the origins of gold, the sound of egg noodles crisping up in the wok, the garden carpeted in kowhai petals, the way my phone corrects Romati, summer, to rainstorm. The day after my grandmother died was white gold in colour. A star explodes and wings are found among the debris, along with pieces of a character I never memorized, our only name for her, poor, a woman beneath a wave. Drift, she mouths softly in English. What is drift? My mother translates into her language, not one of mine. I try to make myself remember by writing pour over and over on squares of paper covering the walls, so I am surrounded by the women and the water radicals they hold close. The tips of waves touch me in my sleep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina. Denise, would you like to continue?
Hi everyone, it's a real pleasure to be here. I don't have any reading to kind of share with everyone as such, but what I have with me is my, I'm going to show you, is my mother's pajamas. And the reason why I brought this with me is to kind of overarch this kind of idea about the notion of belongings, both longing kind of within the metaphysical, but also in the physical. And I suppose as an artist and a writer, veering into poetry, I'm really interested in different ways of knowledge constructions through material culture that offers a counter narrative to the construction about Asianness, Asian bodies, Chineseness through the museum, and how can we kind of construct and collage together a different mode of understanding our stories on a really embodied basis through our material things. And this is a two-piece. It's kind of hard for me to sort of show you. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much. So this is a two-piece pajama set. So this is actually the first time I've ever physically showed anyone this, and it's travelled all the way from, Hong Kong to Wales, to various locations that I've lived in: London, back to Wales, to Bristol, to Oxford, to this chamber room right here. So it kind of feels a bit arbitrary. But this was a two-piece pajama set that my mum had bought herself as part of her wider migratory wardrobe. And I just thought it was really, thank you so much, I just thought it was really interesting thinking about this idea of embodiment as opposed to representation, and particularly thinking about the stories of migrant women from the positions of bodies, and particularly that notion of agency and aspiration and what it means to kind of move and how that's furnished by our materials. So that's my contribution in lieu of a reading, and really taking seriously the materialities of our everyday lives in terms of constructing a narrative, and narratives that are more spacious, more complex, more nuanced when thinking about Asian women.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Denise, outlining many of the themes we'll be picking up in the roundtable. And Jenny.
Here, I would like to read a poem from my collection, Letters Home, which was published also by Nine Arches Press, actually. This poem means quite a lot to me in terms of going from home to home. And I think for those people, especially for Asians, actually also for British people, and anyone, soup sometimes bring along a lot of memories and sense of nourishment, especially Chinese lo fo tong for me. A personal history of soups. You taught me soups. A lo fo tong takes hours in the kitchen. Pig lung, best remedy for coughs. The swelling and collapsing of a massive pink sac filling the basin. Yellow cucumber and cowpea nourishes the skin and clears the throat. Chinese courgettes and lean pork dissipates body heat. My brother and I loved your tomato and fish soup. Your own childhood stemmed from the taste of egg flour broth your mother used to make. Coming home, a bubbling clay pot, steam rising from the lid raised by wooden chopsticks, the juicy cartilage between the softened bones. The butcher in England hasn't a clue if you ask for a soup bowl. Say that again? The only one I can make nowadays is chicken and carrot, even without the fresh logai. You said that every Chinese woman must know how to make soups to catch a good husband. Except that Alex has never cared because he is a European vegetarian. The hot and sour soup they have here, even in Royal China, is not half as good. It should have 7 ingredients. You can't call it hot and sour without wooden ear and pig's blood. Not authentic enough. I remember the milky white perfection of golden carp soup in our family haunt, the chili restaurant. You kept reminding me to make more soups for myself, to build up my immune system, and also for beauty. Last time I called you to say, I cannot find the green carrots. They don't grow here. Each year I think of going back because of the soup.
Thank you very much for those readings, which have given us a wonderful start to today's roundtable. I wanted to pick up on a few things that Denise said actually about materiality and ask a bit about what things mean in your work, in all of your work actually, from watches and slippers and pajamas and sewing machines. Objects seem to have an extraordinary kind of life world in all of your work. Which is in a way, I guess, maybe possibly a bit counterintuitive, because when we think about home, we often think about the beloved people who dwell in home rather than about the objects that inhabit a dwelling place. But your work seems to situate homeliness in the object world. Can you say a bit more about why that might be, why material objects are so entangled with ideas of home and homeliness? And I also wanted to ask, do these objects serve as placeholders for people? Are they anthropomorphized, in other words? Or do they hold on to their own identity as objects in your work?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting kind of questions, thinking about the entanglement of people's lives and, you know, the materiality of that. And I suppose, you know, what was really interesting was thinking about these pajamas and also thinking about the stories, because what was really significant about these pajamas was that it made me kind of think about where did these pajamas come from. And that was the first time I'd had this conversation with my mother about that journey from, you know, one continent into another. And then I started to kind of make a whole load of different artwork related to that notion of embodiment. And then started thinking, you know, what might be in the bottom of other British Chinese women's wardrobes and cupboards, and what might be the kind of stories, you know, entangled in our everyday material culture and diasporic material culture. So what was really interesting was the way that objects was used as a way to negotiate belonging. You know, so for example, one of the women in which I spoke to, you know, we had this kind of 3-hour-long interview, and she presented to me a dozen green crew neck t-shirts, and they were all identical. And I was like, okay, what is this about? And she went on to explain that she was somebody that was very ambitious at the age of 14, decided she was going to go to Cambridge, study software engineering and work at Google, and sure enough, she did that. But then arrived at Google and felt this real otherness, you know, on a gendered and racialized sense, and thinking, what can I do to negotiate this otherness that is upon my body? And she said to me, I decided to do the Steve Jobs thing, which was to don this uniform as a way to manage this gendered and sexualized and exoticized otherness that she felt upon the body. You know, so she'd go into work and she was an engineer, and people would think that she was that she was, you know, the maid, or she was the person that might be the cleaner, you know. And so I think what was really interesting about that conversation was the way that things, both culturally marked and neutrally marked, are used to negotiate the inequalities in which our bodies, you know, are situated in. So that's kind of one example of kind of many. And I think in that way, coming back to that idea of homeliness, you know, I think the things for sure belong in the home. Right? They kind of come from the home, they come from the domestic space. And in coming from the domestic space, there is also a whole architecture of embodied knowledge within that. But in the kind of wearing the wearing of things, I think it's also about helping the body feel at home in places whereby the body has felt othered in that way. So I think it's kind of interesting thinking about that notion of the construction of home as being kind of collaged together through these disparate things, you know, through the multiple of things, and that having almost like a horizontal kind of knowledge making, right, whereby things come from different places that also represent and embody the push and pull of our identity as a sense of hybridity.
Can I just to add to that? I've written quite a bit about my grandparents' house, which is in Kota Kinabalu in Malaysia, and there are some objects there that I think keep like popping up in my writing. And in 2019, my pawpaw passed away, and one thing that my mum did was kind of clear out the kitchen, and she brought me some random like kitchen objects like pots and pans and chopsticks, which I now use in my kitchen. And so I feel like these objects are, specifically the chopsticks, they keep turning up in my writing. My grandfather also, my gongong, who's still around, he made quilts in his retirement, and he made me and my cousins a baby quilt each. And I think thinking about this more in my adulthood has got me interested in textiles, like Denise, and in clothing, the way that textiles travel, where they've come from, how they get passed down, how they get worn and folded and put away or brought out again. So I think I'm always thinking about threads and materials. And in 2020, I started sewing my own clothes as well. So I think I'm now constantly thinking about the way that our clothes are a part of who we are, and what about secondhand clothing or things that I wear that maybe belong to my mother, and so on. And I have no real answers, but just more questions, I think, about these objects.
It's maybe food is also part of the whole materiality that we, as family, like my mom and dad, they're all very into food culture. So, there's always like a lot of even taking pictures of how you cook and how you, the kind of dishes. And I still remember my mom, every day she would prepare fresh meals, and every time it would be very different, like there are all three or four dishes. And I also spent quite a lot of time when I was younger going to the wet market with her, and so selecting the ingredients and actually seeing the textures and colors of different Asian foods or fruits and so on. So I think like I do kind of feel like everything that you can see like visually sometimes really help us to kind of bring that sense of home back. And the recipes that we've kind of passed on to each other.
So one of the questions, we had a little bit of a pre-roundtable chat yesterday, and one of the topics that came up in our chat was that of the connection between home and a sense of comfort, and a sense of sort of what's a comfort zone? Is home automatically a comfort zone? Is it not? And how does that relate to material culture and materiality? And this was partly inspired by Nina's wonderful work, which she also has here, Small Bodies of Water. And one of the things you talk about in that work, as well as you mentioned just now, was a sense of not just objects that you took along, which you just described, but also objects that have fallen behind that we don't take along. And so I wonder, can you talk to us a little bit about that connection between objects left, objects taken, and a sense of comfort or discomfort at notions of home?
Yeah, I think I'm always writing towards and away from the idea of home and what that means to me, and it's always changing. And so it is, I think, in that sense, inherently shifting. Maybe that does mean that there is always some discomfort. You know, if someone would ask me, where's your home? I never have an answer ready for them. I have to think about it. And I think so I grew up in lots of different places, but I was born in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and lived by the sea. And that particular ocean landscape, the harbour, the islands in the harbour, the very regular earthquakes that happen in New Zealand, growing up with that, has made me often think about weather and climate and how the climate changes each time I go back home. Things are different in the landscape. The shape of the coastline has changed. Things have eroded, trees have disappeared, or new things have cropped up. So I think this particular ocean landscape has been one that has informed my thinking about what home means and how it's always changing. And I kind of try to hold in my head like an image of my childhood home, trying to like keep it the same. But when you go back there, it is often not what you remember. So I'm interested in that tension between memory, maybe things we've seen in photographs which seem real, but sometimes I'm not sure if it's a real memory or if I'm just thinking of a photograph, which is a really common feeling, I think. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah, I think that idea, like just thinking about that idea of what is held and what is lost, makes me think back to this Object Stories project a lot, and specifically how women interact very differently depending. So their relationship with objects was very different depending on their generational position. So I collaborated. So two generations of British Chinese women, and the first generation, I ran this bilingual art school that ran for 8 months, and then the second generation, their availability was a lot more limited, so we just ran this kind of one workshop, and it had a lot of interviews that went along with it. But when I was collaborating with the first generation, and they were elders, they were retired, they went to this Chinese community center to learn English, and I remember going there with my suitcase, and with my suitcase of kind of art materials, and kind of trying to sort of tell them my story, my relationship with objects, and see what things that they might have. And what was really curious was that a lot of the women said to me, actually, the things that I migrated with, I either don't have, they've worn out, or I've pawned them off. And so there was this kind of sense that they didn't put the same significance on their things in the way that I did as a second generation. And I thought that was really interesting, and that idea of being a first generation migrant woman, and how that, at least for the people that I collaborated with, and how that kind of framed their relationship with materiality. And during this, this was also a PhD project, and I was thinking, oh gosh, what am I going to do? The project's all about material culture and our relationship with them. But there's this sense of absence, there's this kind of gap, this kind of severing. And then I realized that actually there was this sense of not wanting to look back. And through holding on to things from the past, there's an orientation to the past, and they were very focused on the future. So I thought that was really interesting in the way that objects orientate us in different kind of pivots. And for the first generation, they were far more interested to kind of make artwork as a way of talking about their lives and talking about their sense of agency in a way that they can piece that together, with a lot more creativity and kind of humor than solely kind of talking about oneself kind of through things. So I think that idea of kind of presence and absence is really interesting, and the significance of absence in that way. Yeah.
It's just so amazing how the difference between the different generations, because even for my mom, for example, she has she doesn't want to explain her history, or what happened to her, or the in terms of the things that she has kept. She doesn't actively show us, but I think, for example, this also reminds me of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who has bound feet, and seeing the rituals of having bound feet, and how she moved around in the space, in the living space, and all that, the small shoes that she have, and kind of reminded me a lot of how we live that space, and how we move in terms of home, like from one space to another, and this kind of how our own mothers, as examples, are they, they have their own stories, and how do we carry those like more invisible things with us as stories when we go to make our different home in another country. So.
Jenny, you've touched on this a bit already, but I wanted to ask you and everyone a bit more about food. When we think of food, it's very closely associated, of course, with nostalgia. It has a kind of double whammy of scent and taste, which can evoke our deepest sort of cellular memories of home. But in your work, I also felt that food was playing another kind of role, that it was acting as a form of language, in particular, perhaps transgenerationally or intergenerationally. When words fail, food seems to do the talking. Can you say a bit more about how food works communicatively in your work?
Yeah, sure. I think these are probably what we share. We do share in common that sort of language across borders, as in when I was writing, I think food tends to come to me as some sort of way to transcend the situation. And I think like it's always a reminder of the kind of past, or the home that I moved away from. But at the same time, I think it's also a way of Chinese families. There are lots of ways that we don't say what we mean to say to each other. And so food becomes kind of the things that bind us together, and it becomes an easier language in a way. And also, I think sometimes even politically, it can be a way of holding together families and communities, that it is something that is easy for us to share and bring along with us, especially when you move to another country. And I think this happens a lot when it's like over phone calls, for example, with my parents. I think these are things that they can ask quite easily, and we can communicate. And I'm sure that Denise and Nina can share your views. And so, in a way, like that sensuous quality can transcend the way how we are physically apart, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Kind of when there's no language, then there's always food, right? Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, I guess when thinking about food, something that I guess food has kind of informed my own work and my own practice is some of the work that I did in a zine of collective care. Yeah, so the Zine of Collective Care was a project that I ran that was part of the University of Westminster, and this was also in response to the pandemic and COVID-19 and the sense of racism that a lot of Chinese, Southeast Asian communities were facing at the time and still are facing now, right? And especially during a time where there was a lot of hostilities around our bodies and also around food practices within Chinese culture and East and Southeast Asian Chinese food practices. So this, and we were all in lockdown, and the very physicality of our bodies and also food practices were highly politicized. And being an artist and being a writer, a lot of my work took place in a physical space, kind of with bodies, with people doing things, making things. And suddenly kind of finding myself, like a year after the PhD, kind of completely isolated and unable to do my work. And so I was kind of asking myself, and I think a lot of us were, what can we do in this situation? And what arose out of that was that, okay, maybe I can facilitate these workshops, these creative art workshops over, a digital kind of interspace. And so one of the activities that we ran were these collective recipe making Zoom workshops. So I would kind of, put participants into Zoom rooms and ask them to choose a recipe or a food that has a significance for them, and ask them to write a creative recipe. And the ingredients can be both physical but can also be emotional. So that was quite interesting. So some of the recipes were, I think one recipe was a recipe for pig trotters, and that being this act of resistance against this, against this kind of projection of Chinese food practices, and then also other recipes that belonged very nostalgically within families. So I think thinking about food, I think is very interesting, thinking about that from the point of view of recipes within the family, but also that being a form of social and political kind of resistance, against this kind of colonial white gaze in terms of food practices within Asian cultures. So that was quite an interesting workshop to facilitate, because I never facilitated a workshop kind of in that way, but it really kind of stressed, it gave a way for people to do something in isolation, and that was a time that we were kind of finding ourselves in.
I don't have a lot more to add. It was really beautiful to listen to both of you speak about that. But I write a lot about food. I am always thinking about food and what I'm going to eat next. So, when I was growing up, so my maternal grandparents, they speak Hakka and Cantonese and Mandarin. And my pawpaw in particular, she did not speak English, so food was our shared language, and that's where we communicated and got to know each other. So I think food was my way in, because when I was very young, like when I was a child, I really rejected like Saturday in Chinese school, which is very, very common. I hated it. I wasn't interested, but food stuck with me because I love to eat. And I think I learned from my pawpaw and my mum. Not so much, I didn't necessarily learn how to cook from them. I do love cooking, but I think what they taught me was how to eat. And so I've written a lot about that. And I think cooking for me is really an extension of my creative practice as a writer and artist, as a kind of act of making. And recently in particular, as because I have anxiety, so a lot of the time I'm trying to kind of slow down and get into doing things with my body, my hands, and cooking is one of those things that I can really enjoy. And takes me outside of myself a little bit, and helps me in every way, helps me feel at home.
And I just want to add to that, because I think what you said there was kind of really interesting. And just thinking about the poem that you shared with us, you know, and about the kind of healing properties that comes with Chinese food, that comes with Chinese culture. And especially, I think, when we're in the diaspora and you're kind of given this medicinal food and that sense of, that sense of otherness that is projected kind of around the food. So I think kind of in amongst food, there's also the knowledge as well, you know, in amongst the kind of eating. You know, I feel like the last couple of years, and actually since the pandemic, I've just been really kind of appreciating, you know, the food actions, you know, in Chinese medicinal kind of soups, and knowing what they do, and, you know, damp heat, and, you know, expelling the wind, you know, all these kind of things that I think as a teenager I completely rejected, you know. So I think in amongst the eating, there's also that sense of re-remembering, you know, that knowledge that is, you know, that is part of our bodies.
Becoming a Chinese auntie at last, like fully evolving.
Yes, absolutely, and keeping going.
Yes.
This is actually a really nice segue into my next question, which is for you, Denise, but it's also for everybody else. And I think what you may have already noticed is there's an incredibly strong presence of women in all of your writing, and also the stories you tell about objects, the stories you tell about materiality. They're focused, even if they're not purposefully, like in the case of your website, Denise, but even if they're not purposefully focused around women, women have an incredibly strong presence. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the role of, you know, of women, of intergenerational connections between women, which you alluded to a little bit in your writing and in all of your writing.
Yeah, I think the intergenerational connection is something that really kind of permeated the Object Stories project. And I said at the beginning about this different relationship to material culture through the generations. And coming back to that project, something I didn't anticipate until the kind of very end. And which case I was like, you know, it's too late. I'm in the writing up. I can't go back. But something that really emerged was the fact that because I had done, you know, I'd ran an art school and workshops in two different generations, and the spaces were quite distinct in that way. When I went back to the women to kind of speak with them to ask, you know, what else would you have liked to have happened through the workshop? You know, a lot of the women said it would be great to have an intergenerational workshop and to be in the same space together, and to have that sense of exchange, have that sense of speaking and talking and making, doing, because a part of the project, so I ran 8 months of art workshops around objects, accompanied by interviews. So that got all curated into the Object Stories website that acts as an archive for the project. And then there was an opening event at Westminster, and I remember at the time being very stressed about it, as you know, as is the case with events and logistics. And I had invited the women from Harringay that I've been collaborating with to come to the opening event for the Object Stories, and just thinking to myself, oh, are they going to come? And what was really kind of palpable was just the sense of pride. That they had been part of this project, that they had made things, that they'd made art, and it was visible and it was public. And I think that was a really powerful moment that has really stayed with me in that way. And so that was one moment whereby I'd invited the first generation together at this opening event. And, you know, you could really sort of see this curiosity kind of each other, and that sense of lack in that way. It highlighted that sense of lack whereby, you know, one's understanding of one's culture is highly personal and therefore private, as opposed to a discourse that is publicly kind of been fleshed out, historically, So I think that was a really kind of powerful moment and feeling and realizing that there is a need to kind of heal and to construct and make together through art, and just how powerful that can be. Yeah.
It's really powerful, Denise, what you said. And I particularly feel like what you mentioned about that power, that kind of engagement with power among women, and how they also, articulate themselves through personal experiences. I think the very core of that cultural specificity of people really fascinates me, especially in terms of different women, like how they choose to, lead their journey, carry on with their journeys. So I think like some of my poetry also engage with that, and our explorations of, for example, Diary of a Miu Sales Girl, that poem, which actually it's the pamphlet that was published by Nina's Bittermelon Poetry. It talks about how women, like in the persona of a retail sales girl, like the perspective of how other women, because of their different classes, how they interact and how they kind of see the world or seize their fate. And at the same time, how we transcend that sort of racial identity. How, as you say, how in this diasporic space, like how women live their lives and choose to have courage to do what they can. And I'm also very fascinated with how, personally, for example, like my own, grandmother and my mother, how they choose to, use their knowledge, what sort of knowledge do they have? And, like there's one of my poems engage with that, like, because for her, having her daughters study in England is a very daunting, thinking, idea. Like she's always worried. I think a lot of overseas parents for overseas students worry about their children, how are they going to carry themselves, and how do they, have courage to face a new world. Yeah, I don't have much more to add on this, but I think I'm often writing about various modes of Asian femininity and kind of figures from folklore and mythology I grew up with, and pop culture. And very often I'm also writing about my mum and my grandmother, but also kind of keeping that awareness, like that worry that we sometimes feel as writers and artists, maybe when we're starting out, particularly, of like being wary of kind of flattening these very real people to kind of idealize figures on the page, the Asian grandma, the Asian mum, when in fact, in my head, they're very, very real and complex. So there's a tension there that I'm often thinking about, still absolutely working through, and figuring out how sometimes to have their voices present, or sometimes it's a version of them very much through me. And I think post-pandemic in particular, I've been thinking more about specifically what it means to be of dual heritage. Sometimes in white spaces I'm invisible, other times I'm very visible, and I kind of never know which it's going to be. So I'm always writing about that and thinking about that.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question, Margaret, and then we could open it up to Q&A.
Let's do that. So reading through your work and your creative projects, I do get a very strong sense of how creativity in its different forms is a community building process, particularly in a home away from home situation. And as you said very eloquently during the pandemic, that was particularly important. More people were finding themselves the targets of race-based abuse and aggression. I think it's also important because so much scholarship and research on diaspora more generally sees the heritage cultures as the site of homeland. and there's been a lot less attention focused on alternative home building in different sites or different locales. So your work's very important in that sense. But I'm also struck, particularly reading your work, Nina, but throughout, that writing is also about self-care. And I was struck by a quote that you mentioned in your work, Denise, from Aldo Lord, who writes that self-care is not self-indulgence, it's not self-preservation, it's actually about resistance, it's a form of political warfare even. And can you say a bit more about this, perhaps the tension between the collectivity, the community and the self, and do you agree that self-care can be a form of something political?
Yeah, I do agree, and I absolutely feel that tension that you mentioned between a kind of collective sense of coming together and collective community, and then and just myself. I spend a lot of time at the moment, particularly at home with my dog, and I naturally a lot of my creativity takes place as a solitary thing for me, and that is really important. But I often think of writing or any kind of making as my kind of a slow form of resistance, a quiet form of resistance, and however small, that is really important to me. And then the collective part of it for me is often an online space. So I think there are many different forms of community, and because I spend a lot of time on the internet, for me that is online. And I did quite a similar project to Denise actually in 2020 called Stay Home Diary, where I invited Asian artists and writers to just submit short diary entries of their experience of isolation and lockdown. And we did it for 30 days from March to April 2020. And it's still online on the Bitter Melon website. And we made a little zine. And that was really special. It was really short. The idea of journaling, doodling, or just writing really short diary entries as a form of resistance was really, really powerful, I think, because a lot of us were feeling exhausted, tired, maybe physically unwell, our mental health kind of suffering, and worry about racism and all this stuff. And so just putting those thoughts down, making a record, kind of a way of saying this is happening, we exist. We're all apart at the moment, but here online we are actually together in the same space.
Yeah, I think Audre Lorde's kind of quote about self-care, always kind of comes back to me. And I think about how our bodies are very sensitive to regimes of oppression, and that can manifest through physical health, can manifest as mental health. And I think kind of in that way, how we take care of ourselves enables oneself to then take care of each other. And I think this really resonates with me, particularly as within my practice, there's a thread within my practice which is very kind of community-centered, that is about building communities, working with communities, maybe creating spaces in which they don't already exist. And that in itself is incredibly rewarding, but also, the fact that you're working against the system and the structures, that in itself is hard work and fatiguing. So I think but I think alongside that, I think within the process of making is always an act of hope. And in bringing people together, that has a generative kind of wonder in that way.
Yes, I agree. And also, I think this also reminds me of our the project that Jennifer, Professor Altahan, has introduced, that makes it happen, is also at the beginning when we were planning this whole project. I think it was at the end of the pandemic, and it felt very unrealistic or very
dreamlike to try to envisage, can we try to make all these writing workshops in here in person, and how are we going to do that? Will they be cancelled or alternative Zoom meetings? And so I think that's like this healing effect of making things together and trying to have that space to kind of renew our hope as artists to be able to engage with each other, and also in addition, being in England and having that sort of growing community of other women or other Asian writers being able to have these books out, like Nina and Denise and all the others and Sarah Howe and so on, just make me feel like there's this sense of permission that to write is possible, and that we can kind of tell all sorts of stories.
Yes, you reminded me of the fact that we once double planned everything. So thank you very much. These were, I think, very inspiring contributions and thoughts. We have a couple of minutes left. Now, would anybody like to ask a question of our presenters? So who would like to kick us off with an answer to any one of the questions or both? Jenny?
I can try to address some of that, and thank you for Charlie and Caroline for your very inspiring questions. And I think in terms of Hawaiian and who are the Asians or Chineseness, and I think it's an ongoing debate rather, but my take is that I feel that we have all elaborated to different extent the sort of belonging, like the sense of belonging, or the sense of feeling that sense of affinity and common ground. So I don't think it's necessarily to do with even the racial. It's not like that you have to have both parents coming from a certain place, but rather like this sort of longing that you have, which I think kind of makes people share things together, share dreams, or share the kind of imagined homes together. But as to Caroline's comment, I will see if anyone wants to respond as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question about, the notion of being an insider and an outsider, right? And it makes me think about, the construction of identity kind of more broadly, right? And the construction of identity, and there's this kind of imagined, kind of unified kind of sense of arrival whereby you are whole, which I think has quite an oppressive kind of bear on us, and that sense of oppression is both racial, it's both gendered, it's both about your sexuality, it's both about it's all that kind of normativity, right? And that normativity kind of runs through so many kind of different lines. And for me, I think what I'm more interested is less about a sense of origin. However, there might be that kind of sense of pressure in order to identify or find an origin. But however, on a lived reality, on a lived basis, I think we are always negotiating and constructing and compiling and recompiling what ourselves are, both in the past, both in the present, and kind of even in the future kind of thing. So I think kind of thinking about the space that we're kind of in, which is a very kind of creative space, thinking about writing, thinking about art, thinking about kind of visual culture more broadly. I think there is that propensity in which to kind of break normative structures in order to remake, and to remake in a way that has kind of more emotive kind of spaciousness kind of in that way. So yeah, I yeah, so I don't have. Yeah, so I would say it's I think it's up for us to kind of remake and redevise, and I feel kind of within that prospect is that sense of a negotiation of a belonging rather than an arrival. The arrival never arrives.
Yeah, I think Jenny and Denise, you put that really beautifully, because I was remembering in my Mandarin classes, like learning that kind of vocabulary, 华人华侨, and being really unsure, like what category do I fit in, if any category at all. And then there's other labels like 混血, which mixed blood, which I get, which I've heard when I go to China, and that is like a little bit derogatory. So I think I'm always writing against these categories. I think it's simple as that, really. Just as Denise said, I think they are useful kind of in the beginning of us kind of negotiating and thinking about who we are and our origins, but then we move beyond them or combine them, or it becomes more complex, I think. So yeah, thinking about that, the second question, which I really loved, I did not expect that I would write like a nature memoir, or like a swimming book, which is what I ended up doing after I wrote a collection of poems, which were about language and food and belonging. And then I started writing more about swimming and about how I've always loved to swim, and I lived in a lot of different places, and I would always kind of seek out places to swim, and that is where I would feel more grounded and more myself, and more at home in the world. So yeah, in the end, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that I did that, but I was surprised me at the time that I would kind of write this book all about water. Thank you for your question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Maybe time for one or two more questions? Are we good? Okay, wonderful. Would anybody else like to ask? Okay, please. Thank you. Who would like to take?
Okay, I will go. I think what you said there was really, it's really kind of interesting, thinking about the kind of the pain of the home, right? Because I think about one of my initial homes, which was, so I was raised, upstairs of a takeaway, and I feel like it's only really now that I'm really kind of processing the difficulty of that, because the home wasn't just a home. The home was also a shop. The home was a place of demand. The home wasn't really for us, really. Our home was kind of was a service for somebody else, So as an artist, it's kind of interesting, thinking about the debris of the takeaway. So my parents, kind of last 2 years have retired, and kind of very, in that very Chinese way, very hardworking, very strong work ethic, would only ever have kind of Christmas and Boxing Day off a year. And that sense of kind of pain and denial of kind of comfort in that way. And I feel that sense of home goes through lots of different phases, and it's probably only in the last couple of years, and maybe through, through the project, kind of through the thesis, and kind of having that space in which to be with other people in a public space, that you can actually process some of this kind of trauma on a very kind of personal level, and I'm thinking about as well, about the migration patterns, of kind of Chinese communities to the UK. A lot of homes are businesses, are restaurants, are takeaways. So I think there is that, it's for sure a real contested site, and it's not a singular site. And I feel as though it belongs to many layers that we are constantly unpicking. And I feel this unpicking is only starting to kind of happen now in the last couple of years. For sure, thinking, I was born in Wales. My parents moved from Hong Kong, moved from China to Cardiff, set up takeaways, set up restaurants. This conversation would not have been happening when I was a teenager, for sure, right? So I feel I'm still unpicking all these layers of home, and that desire to seek comfort when you've always been in a place of kind of seeking for something else, whether that is security or safety, is something I'm still feeling kind of comfortable with. It's still kind of landing with me.
Thank you for this, Denise. I think we're slowly coming to the end of our time, but if either Nina or Jenny, if you had anything you still wanted to contribute, I don't want to cut us off prematurely. I think this is a conversation we will be continuing in a way even as we go into the poetry reading in about 20 minutes time circa. So thank you very much to everyone for coming and joining us at this conversation today. Thank you very much to Margaret, Nina, Denise, and Jennifer for participating. Now we will have, for those of you, I presume most of you know this, but just in case you don't, there is a reading at 6:30 of poetry that was produced as part of these creative writing workshops, but also produced as part of populating that wonderful website that Jenny has set up on the Torch server. So if you have time, please join us. If you don't, please take a look at the website. It is a wonderful kaleidoscope of writing and art, and even is there some music on it as well, some clips? Coming soon. Oh, we're coming soon. Sorry, I briefly thought we were already live. In which case, watch the space. The space is populated behind the scenes. It looks wonderful, and once it goes live, it will be a wonderful resource, and I hope you will enjoy it. In the meantime, please join me in thanking everyone, and have a lovely evening for those of you who leave at this point.